was Titanic set up by Smith on the orders of J.P. Morgan to enter this ice field at high speed? So it's highly significant, of course, that Guggenheim, Astor, and Strauss were all well known to be opponents of the Federal Reserve, and they were probably the most well known of the victims. World War One had been planned as early as 1890, but they needed the finance, and the Federal Reserve provided that. Well, I believe that the British government and the US government were in collusion on this as well.
Hello and welcome to Resistance Podcast. My name's Emma Dunwell. I'm here today with John Hamer via Zoom. So it's nice to finally meet you, put a face to the name. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit more about who you are?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, hi, Emma. Thanks for having me on the show. As you say, my name's John Hamer. I'm a geopolitical researcher, analyst, author, and public speaker. And I've been examining the truth of what's really going on in the world for the last 27 years. I was woken up by the death of Princess Diana, and it just kind of went from there.
So obviously the main thing that I wanted to talk to you about today is, I suppose, what I would consider to be one of your most daring theories and most interesting. We're all taught in school from a young age the story of the Titanic, how it was the unsinkable ship that then sunk. In high school, in my class, I don't know if this is anyone else's experience, but we were taught to kind of try and think about our own theories and talk about the watertightness of the construction of the ship. But you propose an entirely different theory. Would you just like to give us a rundown of your theory of what happened on the Titanic and compare it to what we've been taught?
There were two threads to the story, and you understand this is very much in a nutshell. Thread number one is the fact that it had been involved in a series of accidents, and one of them which was particularly significant, and this caused it to be declared a wreck. Okay, sorry, not the Titanic, but RMS Olympic, because there were two twin sisters. The RMS Olympic was the first one to be launched, followed by Titanic, and they were virtually identical. Not quite, and this is how we know this story, but almost identical. But Olympic, in her first few months of service, she'd been subjected to several accidents. One really serious one, which caused her, as I said, to be declared a wreck for insurance purposes. Now, in addition to that, there was another thread to the story. J.P. Morgan, who owned the White Star shipping line, and he had lots of financial interests in the US, he was also one of the proponents of the Federal Reserve, and he was one of the people responsible for the Federal Reserve coming into being. But before he and his Federal Reserve gang, for want of a better word, could actually bring that into being, there was a concerted effort to stop it, because the vast majority of people in America did not want it. They'd tried central banks before, which is what the Federal Reserve is, and they had caused chaos, and it caused poverty and all sorts of other problems. So but there were four prominent men who actually opposed the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank, not because of any sympathy with the poor people of America, but because they knew that the way that central banks work is that they create money from thin air for a start, and this creates inflation, raging inflation. And they knew that if the Federal Reserve Bank came into play, then it would severely affect their own personal fortunes. Now, those four men were Charles Lindbergh Sr. Now, some people probably heard the name Charles Lindbergh. It was his son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., funnily enough, and he was a famous aviator, and he was the first person to fly the Atlantic solo. But it wasn't him, it was his father. His father was a congressman at the time, and he was offered a bribe of $2 million, and $2 million in 1912 or 1910 was an absolute vast sum of money. You can just about multiply that by 100. So it was knocking on for $250 million not to publish a book that he had written, which was exposing all the tricks and the shenanigans that the Federal Reserve would probably get up to as all central banks do. So the other three were Benjamin Guggenheim, who was a railroad and mining entrepreneur, very, very wealthy man. John Jacob Astor, similarly, he was he was in the leisure industry, and he was regarded as the richest man in the world at the time. And another guy by the name of Isidore Strauss, who was he owned Macy's department store in New York, and he also had banking interests as well. So those four men opposed it. Now, interestingly enough, three of them died on the Titanic. I believe that they were actually enticed onto the Titanic's maiden voyage, which was really Olympic because it swapped the identities of the ships as part of the insurance scam, and also to kill two birds with one stone, and that was to get rid of three of the men who were involved in opposing the Federal Reserve, and because they were winning. Okay. Now, Morgan, I believe, personally invited them onto the launch because it was a very, very big gala occasion. The maiden voyage of the Titanic, and people were invited. Very prominent people were invited on, and it was actually full of celebrities of the day, if you like. So yeah, those are the two threads. Now, what I normally do when I talk about the Titanic, I usually tell the story chronologically. So I don't know if you want me to do that. I mean, you feel free to chip in at any time, but that's the way I normally tackle it because it's a lot easier to understand if I do it like that rather than skip about just talking about bits here and bits there of it, because it tends not to make sense.
Obviously, what I think mainly people get from this theory of the actual history of the Titanic is something that you watch in a movie. People would probably not believe it because it is just so unbelievable.
Yeah.
But that's why I think it's so interesting, because we've seen instances like this in so many other points in history. And I think that the
Absolutely.
Titanic is a really perfect example that encases all of it, because there is not a single person on the planet, I dare say, that hasn't at least heard of or knows the name Titanic.
Absolutely.
So yeah, if you want to go through it chronologically, that would be brilliant.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Titanic has got such a dramatic. It's just such a dramatic story. It contains just about every element that goes to make up a good story. It's got love interest. It's got rich versus poor. It's got tragedy, and as you say, everybody's heard of the Titanic. And I'd always been fascinated with it, from being a small child, because obviously you only get to hear the official version unless you watch shows like this. Yeah. So anyway, okay. Well, let me just start off by saying, okay, I researched this story for 3 years, from 2010 to 2013. That's all I did for 3 years. I shelved all my other work and I just concentrated on the Titanic. And I got all this information from the public inquiry transcripts, because there were two public inquiries, the American one and the British one. Harland and Wolff, who built the ship, they have public records, not on the internet. They are, but some of those are available on the internet, but the vast bulk of them are not. So I looked at Harland and Wolff public records, various different archives. I looked at contemporary newspaper reports in libraries, and obviously the internet. But I also looked, and this is where I got a lot of quite useful information from. I looked at the Marconi wireless transcripts, which are only available in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. They're not on the internet. So yeah, that was quite revealing.
So for anyone who might not know, could you just explain a little bit about what those transcripts are and what revelation they give you?
Yeah, sure. These are the transcripts of all the conversations that were going on that night when Titanic sank, with all the ships in that area in the North Atlantic. So all the different messages. I mean, there was no voice wireless in those days. It was only Morse code, but obviously those have been interpreted and transcripted into into the written word. So yeah, like I said, there's so much to say, it's hard to know where to begin. But let me just start and say that, first of all, for those who are not aware, the incident happened at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, the 14th of April, 1912, and the ship sank approximately 3 hours later. at 2:20, 2:30 in the morning on Monday the 15th. Now, interestingly enough, I discovered that this apocryphal official story that we all know and love so much, this was actually originally a story, a book written by a guy called Walter Lord, who was an American. In fact, he was a CIA agent, and this was written in the early 1950s, and it was called A Night to Remember. And this was also made into a film in the late 1950s. Some people out there may have seen it. I've watched it a couple of times. But it immediately begged the question to me, what was a CIA agent doing writing a story about a shipwreck 40 years earlier? And, as it turned out, distorting all the facts too. It was all rather strange to me, and my research bore that out eventually. So, as I said earlier, there are two strands to the story. In 1908, J.P. Morgan, who was head of the huge financial corporation of the same name, and also he was the ultimate owner of the White Star shipping line, to which Olympic and Titanic belonged. And in 1908, he decided to build 3 luxury liners with a mandate of becoming the most luxurious in the world. And these were going to be in order, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. So 3 ships were to be built, almost, but not quite identical. And he asked Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast to commence construction. Now, there was a massive investment of money required, and this is a very important point. And this was financed by J.P. Morgan personally, and it was a huge gamble. This plan depended on absolutely everything going right. But as we'll see, as I talk you through the sequence of events, the whole enterprise was beset with problems, which of course ultimately ended in tragedy. Now, also, as I also said, RMS Olympic was the first of the 3 sisters to be built, and she was launched in 1911. But unfortunately, again, as I said, she had several serious accidents, 4 in fact, all before the launch of Titanic. So in other words, the first few months of Olympic's life. She destroyed a tugboat in New York Harbor on a maiden voyage, and White Star Line was sued. Fortunately, no deaths occurred, and the damage to Olympic was minimal. Secondly, she ran over a sunken wreck at Sandy Hook whilst leaving New York Harbor, and this caused severe damage to her propellers. She returned back across the Atlantic at about half speed, but suffered even more vibrational damage due to the imbalance caused by the propeller damage, and 2 propellers had to be replaced. And these are all critical points, by the way. And shortly after that, she hit a sandbank, ran aground, and actually threw a propeller. Threw a propeller means the propeller fell off. Okay, and this also had to be replaced, but they'd already used both spares, so they had to borrow one from the Titanic, which was still under construction. And this is very significant, and we'll return to that point later in the story. Okay, and when we talk about the aftermath. Okay, then finally, the big one. In September 1911, Olympic was involved in a massive high-speed collision with a British Navy battleship known as HMS Hawke. Now, this is known as the Hawke incident in Titanic circles. And this was just after she'd left Southampton Water and preparing to turn westwards, clockwise around the Isle of Wight. So they had to get her back to Southampton somehow. She limped back to Southampton docks to be patched up. But they couldn't do a full repair in Southampton because this was the biggest ship in the world at the time. The only dry dock big enough was the one in Belfast where it was built. So it had to be patched up enough to get it back to Belfast for full repairs. But when they got it back to Belfast, they realised that she was in far worse shape than originally thought. And worse still, anytime there's an accident involving a Royal Navy ship, there is a Royal Naval inquiry into the accident, and this inquiry found Olympic's crew, and therefore White Star Line, culpable, in other words, guilty. White Star was thus liable for many millions of pounds of expenses for repairs to both ships, plus a significant loss of revenues because obviously Olympic would have been out of action for months and months. And this was really critical because, as I said, Morgan's plan depended on absolutely everything going right. Now, amongst many, many other relatively minor issues, thousands and thousands of popped rivets and, bent plates on the ship. The main problem was that the keel, which is the thing that runs along the bottom of the ship and holds it all together, that was bent and distorted out of shape. And the repairs were estimated to cost more than to build a new ship from scratch. Now, I spoke to several seafaring men at the time of my research, and they all told me the same thing. And that was that a twisted or a bent keel equals a total wreck. So White Star Line now realized that Olympic was damaged beyond economic repair, and significantly that she was now uninsurable. Okay, so therefore she was an insurance write-off, and White Star Line had no option but to declare her officially as a wreck, and that actually did happen. Olympic was officially dead, it declared a wreck, a write-off, and documents prove this to be true. Of course, due to the serious damage, she was unable to ply a trade back and forth across the Atlantic to begin to pay her way. And at this point, bankruptcy of White Star Line and Harland and Wolff was definitely on the cards. So I believe at this point, Morgan and his co-conspirators then hatched a plan to kill two birds with one stone, which would solve the White Star financial problems and also remove opposition to the Federal Reserve in one simple move, as I said. And this involved patching up the wrecked Olympic as best they could, bracing the twisted keel with metal struts. And by the way, as an aside here, when Robert Ballard, who allegedly discovered the Titanic wreck site, he actually didn't, that's another story for another day, he was puzzled to find these struts on the wreck of the ship, which didn't actually appear on the construction blueprints.
That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's possible to see the repairs to Olympic superstructure and steel plates in some pictures that they claim are the Titanic prior to the maiden voyage. So you can actually see the repairs to Olympic on pictures of the Titanic if you know where to look and what to look for. And in my book, Aramis Olympic, there's a whole series of photographs in that prove the switch, absolutely prove the switch beyond shadow of a doubt. So this set the scene then for a remarkable scam, a very elaborate scam, but a scam nevertheless. And this was the switching of the identity of the two ships, the almost completed Titanic and the almost wrecked Olympic. And this fact was actually corroborated to me by several Belfast ship workers' families, descendants, of people who'd worked in the shipyard, and they'd obviously passed the story down through their families. Because what I did, as part of my research, I put an advert in the Belfast Evening newspaper. I met three families separately, all individually. None of them knew each other, but they all told me the same story, and that was that their relatives had said to them that they were warned in no uncertain terms that if they ever breathed a word about what had been going on inside that dockyard, then they would never work again, and neither would any of their families. And in those days, that was a serious thing because there was no social security or dole or anything like that.
Well, that was practically a death sentence for them and their
Absolutely.
families.
So how did they do it? I hear you ask. After Olympic's accident with Hawke, she spent many, many weeks in the shipyard at Belfast, and they started making changes to both ships gradually, bit by bit, bit by bit. Now, the main differences in the two ships were eradicated to make them as identical as possible, although that was not 100% practical and viable.
I did want to ask you about, because there was one of the major physical difference to do with the portholes and the number of the portholes on the Olympic versus the Titanic. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. The Olympic had 16 portholes on the port bow on deck A, which was the very top of the ship before all the superstructure on top of the deck. Okay, so it was the very top deck on the main part of the ship. So along that stretch on the port bow, which is the left-hand side, there were 16 portholes on Olympic, and they were all unevenly spaced for some reason. But on Titanic, there were only 14, and they were evenly spaced.
So that's quite a very big, noticeable physical difference that should, to be fair, considering the significance of it, it should be able to stand alone as proof for
Yeah.
what you're saying about the Titanic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's not the only one. I mean, the sea deck on Titanic was totally enclosed, but on Olympic, it was open. So again, it's easy to prove which one is which through photographs. So on one final weekend, all the last cosmetic changes were made. They changed the lifeboats, the menus and letterheads on the ship that were there for the convenience of the passengers, and of course the nameplates. And this was carried out by a small crew of insiders, and these men were paid £100 each. And now £100 doesn't sound very much today.
But it was back then.
At those days, it was a year's wages, and they were also threatened with loss of livelihood, as I mentioned, in the event of this, in the event that they spoke out about it in any way. So, interestingly enough, Olympics maiden voyage took place in June 1911 with no fanfare whatsoever. Titanic was launched in December 1911, renamed the Olympic, and work continued on the original Olympic, which was now Titanic, to make her seaworthy enough for one dramatic final voyage. Okay, now, as I said, there's so many photographs that prove the switch. You know, as I said, in my book, RMS Olympic, there is a series of photographs in there that absolutely prove the switch beyond any shadow of a doubt. So, interestingly enough, on Wednesday, the 10th of April, 1912, Titanic left Southampton, formerly Olympic, which is now Titanic, left Southampton on its maiden voyage for New York, amidst huge celebrations in total contrast to what had happened when Olympic was launched. Now, you would think that the first one off the production line would have been the one that all the fuss was about. But no, for some reason, it was Titanic, and Titanic, it was all over the front pages of many newspapers. I checked on the Olympic, and there was just a couple of column inches here and there. So there was obviously some deliberate attempt to make the Titanic's maiden voyage desirable to celebrities. And I think that they were all enticed on board in order to get those three Federal Reserve conspirators on board in order to murder them. So yeah, when it left Southampton on, as I said, the 10th of April 1912, it had two ports of call at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Ireland. And it only had 2,200 passengers and crew on board. I would say only, it was only half full. We'll come on to that shortly as well, why I believe that to be the case. Now, the transit crew that was responsible for the safe passage of the ship from Belfast to Southampton before the maiden voyage, only two of those signed on for the maiden voyage. Only two. And they both jumped ship at Queenstown, the second stop.
Oh, right.
Interestingly, again, at that time of Titanic's maiden voyage, there had been a coal strike in the whole of the UK, which had been ongoing for 6 weeks. Liners in those days were run on coal. There was steam, and which was generated by coal. For example, Titanic needed 6,000 tons of coal to cross the Atlantic each way.
Wow.
So yeah, so by the time of Titanic sailing, the coal strike had been ongoing for 6 weeks. There were passengers that were desperate for berths on ships, and they were being turned away from Titanic. I believe this was because they wanted it only half full to make it more manageable, because I don't believe they meant to kill everyone. I believe that they only meant to kill a select few people to make it look like an accident, and the rest were going to be surviving. Okay, so they deliberately kept the number of passengers down to make the rescue mission much easier. Now, 5 days earlier than Titanic's maiden voyage, a ship by the name of SS Californian had departed for New York from London, again in the midst of this nationwide coal strike. And by the way, there were no ships going anywhere, but Titanic and Californian managed to. Californian was part of the Red Star Line, also owned by JP Morgan. Okay, so no passengers on Californian at all, despite the huge demand for transatlantic berths, and no cargo at all, except for 3,000 woolen sweaters and 3,000 woolen blankets.
Well, that sounds like a preempted plan to me.
Yes, you could say that. So yeah, as I said, Titanic sailed only half full when there was this huge demand for places. And first-class passengers who were hoping to transfer to Titanic were only offered second-class cabins. And as I said, this was an attempt to keep numbers manageable, because in those days, no respecting first-class passenger would ever lower themselves to travel second class. Just wouldn't happen. On the evening of the 14th of April, which was the night of the disaster, California had stopped dead in the middle of the ice field where Titanic was due to pass shortly. And she drifted with the ice whilst keeping all her boilers fully fired. And 3 experienced transatlantic sea captains gave evidence at the American inquiry that it was not common practice to stop or even slow down in ice fields, as icebergs are extremely visible, even in foggy conditions, and therefore avoidable, even at normal cruising speeds. So at 11:40 p.m. local time that night, Titanic allegedly hit the iceberg and sunk 3 hours later, with the loss of 1,503 lives. Was there even an iceberg? I believe there was, but I don't necessarily believe that Titanic hit it, or if it did, it was deliberately steered into it. Titanic's turning circle was such that it should have easily been able to spot the iceberg in good time and avoid it. But officially, it wasn't spotted until it was, quote, too late. But in reality, we know that the iceberg was seen 4 miles away, which of course is all rather strange, or not.
In your lecture, you spoke about the deceleration speed and the time that it takes for the Titanic to come to a complete stop.
Yes.
And even if they had seen the iceberg and, I don't know, let's say hypothetically they weren't able to maneuver left or right, they still had more than plenty of time to come to a complete stop, figure something out, and then maneuver off. And there was just no attempt to do any of that, was there?
Absolutely not, no. It's a good point, that, yeah. And its stopping distance was half a mile at full speed. So it would have taken half a mile to come to a complete stop. Yet the iceberg was spotted at 4 miles. So yeah, doesn't make sense, does it? Now, the reason I mentioned the iceberg possibly not hitting the iceberg was because people say, "Oh, come on, John, there was lots of ice on the decks." There was even stories about the third-class men chasing around the deck playing at football with huge lumps of ice. And there were jokes going amongst the first-class passengers, saying, "Go out and fetch us a piece of ice to put in my whiskey," and there were things like that. So there was ice on the deck, but that's easily explainable. This was a very, very cold night. It was below zero, and there was copious amounts of ice on all the deck buildings and all the deck structures and all the wiring. The Titanic's wireless aerial ran the whole length of the ship. It was a long piece of wire. There were miles and miles of rigging on the ship, even though it was a steamship, and they would have been absolutely liberally covered with ice at this point in time. And what happened was, eventually, the ship's engines were thrust into reverse. Now, imagine driving along the road and putting your car into reverse. What would happen? Well, you come to a complete stop, but a sudden stop, and you'd be thrown forward. In other words, there'd be a massive jolt.
Yeah.
And that would have, if that was the case with Titanic, which it was, then it would have just absolutely dislodged tons upon tons of ice from the structures on the deck. The damage to Titanic as well was very strange. Now, it was made of 1-inch thick steel plates, and these steel plates had a 15-centimeter wide puncture, which I believe is about like that. I'm not very good at centimeters. I think it's about 4 inches. So about that wide, and that was allegedly 300 feet long and penetrated 1.6 meters, about 5 feet, for all the oldies out there like me, into the inner skin of the ship. So that would have needed a really bizarrely shaped ice outcrop or an iceberg to achieve that.
Well, very dense as well, to be able to rip through the steel continuously without snapping off if it was a jagged form.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Defiance Records brings the best music from the freedom movement, from Ramise's Never Give Up and Mad Mix's You're So Right, available as a double A-side on Defiance. to Raw Milk Conspiracy, bringing back the purpose to music with their latest single, This Is England 2024, and their brilliant debut, Misinformation Whore, available on Defiance Records. Join the Moo World Order.
Now, interestingly enough, again, only very few first-class men died on the Titanic.
Shocker.
I think it was about 10. Yeah, shocker. I think it was about 10 from memory. I might be wrong on that, so don't write in, folks. But 3 of them were the Federal Reserve conspirators. And coincidence? Highly unlikely.
I think it's also very suspicious how, I believe you said earlier, was it 2,200 passengers in total, including crew members and everyone on board. And I believe the lifeboats altogether, was there only 10 lifeboats, I think? And in total, the lifeboats altogether could only carry about 1,978 people. And so right there, you've already got loads of people that in the state of emergency, aren't going to be able to get onto those lifeboats.
I actually believe it's a red herring, the lifeboats thing. What happened was the Board of Trade, which had control, the British Board of Trade had control over anything to do with any kind of sea transport, only specified that a certain number of lifeboats were mandatory. And Morgan and the White Star Line were so keen to make the ship as luxurious as possible, with as many facilities as possible, that they only put the barest minimum of lifeboats on board because they did not, they believed that it was unsinkable. Okay, no, they knew that it was going to sink, but if you know what I mean, they portrayed the idea and the impression that the ship was unsinkable.
If you say that you have an unsinkable ship and then you have like
exactly.
100 lifeboats, people are maybe not going to believe you as easily. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's how they justified the number of lifeboats. So I actually think that's just a red herring. That was how the ship was designed. So, I mean, let's talk about how it was actually facilitated and how did they expect to pull it all off.
Well, yeah, I mean, how did they get away with it? Because, I mean, this is such a well-known story.
Yeah.
How do you think they managed to get away with this huge scam?
Well, obviously, it was no accident, so I used the word accident before. It was obviously no accident. I believe that Stanley Lord, who was the captain of the Californian, the SS Californian, that was said was the rescue ship that was waiting there. Now, interestingly enough, several years previously, Stanley Lord had successfully evacuated 2,000 people from a ship in under an hour in a military exercise. So he was the perfect man for the job. So, it's another piece of circumstantial evidence. And as I said before, also, it was the intention to save most of the passengers, but just allow a select few to become victims to cover up the disposal of the Federal Reserve conspirators. Now, the idea was that Californian would be standing by, complete with their blankets and sweaters, to pick up most of the survivors. In fact, several passengers said afterwards, and these are quotes from contemporary newspapers, that they'd been told by White Star Line staff at the time of the incident that the Californian was on its way to pick them up. Yeah, this is where the wireless transcripts come into play. Californian was totally incommunicado, 19 miles away with its wireless switched off and totally beyond visible contact. And there'd been no communications between Californian and Titanic at all at that point. So how did the White Star Line staff know that Californian was on its way to pick them up? Doesn't make sense.
Very suspicious.
And it's more circumstantial evidence, of course.
Yeah. There was something else I wanted to ask you about the signals that were sent up. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, California was expecting red, white, and blue signal rockets, because we know this because Stanley Lord, the captain of the Californian, said this. He kept asking the crew, "Have you seen any rockets?" And they all kept saying, "Well, yeah, just white ones, no coloured ones." And he's saying, and they just went, "Okay, right, okay, well, tell me when you see coloured ones." And they never did. Now, what had happened was there was a ship actually between Californian and Titanic, so somewhere in that 19-mile gap, there was one ship, a much smaller ship, and it was called the Samson, and it was actually an illegal sealing boat. Okay, so it had little boats that were sending out to all the ice floes, and the sailors were clubbing to death the baby seals. Terrible thing, but that was happening, and it was illegal in those days as it is now. And so it was an illegal operation. So the white rockets were to signal from the Samson itself to all the little boats to come back. So that's what
Right.
Californians saw. So the message actually miscarried, and Californian actually never turned up as a result of that, because it kept waiting for these coloured rockets, which never appeared.
So do you think that the plan was for more people to have survived the incident?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there were 705 survivors out of 2,200, but I believe they actually meant to save more than that. The survivors were picked up by a ship called the Carpathia. Californian did not do its job. It never turned up at all. It only found out about the disaster well after Titanic had sunk, the following morning, in fact. So, yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the inquiries, the
Yeah.
aftermath. American and British inquiries were both widely, even in the newspapers, were thought to be whitewashers, okay? There were no witnesses called from the passenger contingent, except for the Gordon family of the famous gin company. And no witnesses were allowed to give personal evidence, and they were strictly forbidden from speaking, other than to give simple answers to direct questions with no elaboration.
Well, that's always a bit of a giveaway, isn't it?
Just a bit.
When you
just a
tell
bit.
someone not to say anything, there's usually a lot to say.
Exactly, yeah. And when he was questioned by the press, Stanley Lord of the Californian said, and I quote, "I am not allowed to give out state secrets." He said, "You'll have to ask those in the office."
Oh, right.
State secrets?
Well, that's very telling. What makes the Titanic a state secret? It's very public knowledge, or so it should be.
Yeah, well, I believe that the British government and the US government were in collusion on this as well. So I'll come on to that, but let's continue chronologically for a little while.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the arrival of the surviving crew members back in England 2 weeks after the disaster, they were all illegally detained overnight in a damp, dank, cold holding pen in Plymouth docks, without any access to legal or union representation, and they were coerced into signing a document that they believed was the Official Secrets Act. Now, for those who are not aware, the Official Secrets Act, if you defy the Official Secrets Act, you are committing treason. Now, I mentioned, did she really hit an iceberg? There were only 5 eyewitnesses to the incident, allegedly. William Murdoch, the first officer, the 2 lookouts in the crow's nest, the helmsman, and 1 other ordinary seaman. And significantly, Murdoch committed suicide in the aftermath of the collision. This left only 4 solid witnesses, all of them 4 working class men. And how easy in those days would it be to keep them quiet through threats to their livelihood and their families' future livelihoods? So was Titanic set up by Captain Smith on the orders of J.P. Morgan to enter an ice field at high speed? Or with the intent of ramming her with some other ship, or because there's something called the Yellow Funnel Steamer incident as well. This is where, actually, at the time of the incident, there was another ship alongside Titanic. Many, many passenger witnesses saw it, in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
Was that involved somehow, or was it steered into an iceberg? We'll never know for sure. But either of those 2 possibilities are plausible, in my view.
Well, I just wanted to go back to what you said about Captain Smith.
Right.
When I watched your lecture about this theory, you spoke about other ships that he'd driven. His driving style was rough, I guess you could say, and he was responsible for a lot of damages to a lot of ships.
He was. He'd been captain for many, many years, and he'd been in charge of at least 10 other ships besides Titanic. But he was the highest paid seaman in the world.
Right.
Okay, he was paid, I can't remember what the figure was, something like £250 a month, which was a lot of money then, those. But yeah, absolutely, a big amount of money. A lot of passengers used to only sail on ships that he was captain of. He was so popular. But to go back to your point, yeah, on at least 6 occasions, he was involved in major, major accidents. He was captain of the Olympic when Olympic had the accident with the HMS Hawke. So yeah, there was a lot of incidents. In fact, some people were actually killed, and he used to drive them like speedboats.
Mm.
It was like the the Edwardian equivalent of a boy racer, if you like. Certainly in those days, I don't know whether it's the case these days, but any ship's captain that has a serious accident that's deemed to be his fault was not allowed to be captain anymore, because insurance companies used to refuse to insure that captain, no matter which ship it was going to be. So there's something, lots of cover-ups going on there. And I believe it was because Captain Smith was so popular that White Star Line didn't want to lose his services, because he personally attracted lots and lots of passengers. So, as I say, was Titanic set up by Smith on the orders of J.P. Morgan to enter this ice field at high speed, in order to provide a plausible cover story, kind of kill two birds with one stone, collect the insurance payout for the wrecked Olympic, which was sank as a Titanic, and also to rid the Federal Reserve conspirators of the powerful enemies. It was all very convenient for Morgan.
It's such a wide umbrella of a story, because it goes down so many routes, so many huge names, so many
rabbit holes.
But I'm absolutely thoroughly fascinated.
Oh, good. Okay, right. Yeah, and then there were 6 significant deaths as well. Captain Smith, Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch, who I mentioned before, who shot himself. And I suspect that all those were privy to the plan. And the other 3 significant deaths were Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor. They were the Federal Reserve guys, or Federal Reserve opponents. Now, there's no real eyewitness evidence of what happened to any of them. According to the official legend, none of them attempted to escape. Captain Smith allegedly decided to go down with the ship. Murdoch shot himself. Okay, why? Well, we know why, because he'd already shot about 4 passengers who were trying to enter lifeboats. And Guggenheim allegedly, and again, this appears in James Cameron's Titanic film, Guggenheim came into the one of the lounge bars, and he said, "I've dressed in my best and I'm prepared to go down like a gentleman." I mean, why would you do that? Why would he not try to escape? And Astor apparently just walked away, never to be seen again, after being denied access to a lifeboat with his pregnant wife.
Wow.
And we're told that Strauss and his wife retired to their stateroom to await death together peacefully. Again, that appears in Cameron's film. And it's all romantic and melodramatic stuff, not to mention very, very convenient.
Well, not to mention completely devoid of most human instinct.
Yeah, and logic.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And interestingly enough, again, Astor's body was found 2 weeks later, because they sent out vessels looking for bodies after the event. And Astor's body was found, and he was only recognizable by the contents of his pocket. His face had been completely battered in.
Battered, as in before drowning, so evidence of brute force.
Violence, yeah, absolutely.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, he had $10,000 in his pocket as well, so it wasn't robbery.
It wasn't just your typical mugging.
Yeah, and $10,000, you multiply that by 100, so it's a lot of money today. A lot more.
Yeah, so it's clearly someone who just wanted to get rid of him because they just wanted to get rid of him.
Exactly, and it was nothing to do with any robbery or anything like that. J.P. Morgan and 50 of his close associates and friends cancelled their voyages at the last moment. Also, the chairman of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, his wife didn't turn up at the last minute. The reason given was illness. And then she was seen on a motoring holiday in Ireland with her sons. And also, J.P. Morgan was interviewed, said he was ill and he couldn't go. But yet, the very next day, he was interviewed at a French holiday resort with his mistress. So it's highly significant, of course, that Guggenheim, Astor, and Strauss were all well known to be opponents of the Federal Reserve. And they were probably the most well known of the victims. As I said, very few of whom were actually first class passengers. It was mainly third and second class that died. So the upshot was that Morgan got his insurance payout, and the Federal Reserve came to pass the following year with little to no resistance. And this enabled the elite, I hate that word actually, the cabal, to begin the next phase of the Grand Plan in 1914. and engineer the outbreak of World War One, because this is what the Federal Reserve was all about. It was financing World War One. World War One had been planned as early as 1890, but they needed the finance, and the Federal Reserve provided that. Now, the British Liberal government at the time, under Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, were all complicit in this scheme, I believe, because they knew that if Olympic had to be scrapped, then Harland and Wolff and White Star would have gone too. And it's almost certain that Morgan would have cut his losses and seized his own assets, which were the ships. And the British government knew that World War One was coming up, and they needed them as troop carriers. Okay, so
Right.
the remaining passenger ships were actually requisitioned as troop carriers during World War One. But if they'd gone bankrupt, Morgan would have pulled out, taken the ships with him, and in addition to that, the damage to the British economy would have been colossal. The unemployment figures alone, 30,000 at Harland and Wolff, another 15,000 at White Star, and countless thousands more in associated dependent industries. Then the Liberal government would absolutely have faced a humiliating defeat at the next election. No question about it. So when Robert Ballard, allegedly discovered the wreck of the Titanic, they knew all along, right from day one, where the wreck was, by the way, but they just weren't telling anyone. So apparently,
That's very interesting.
Yeah, Ballard went looking for it. See, the other thing is that, of course, that Titanic was sunk in the very deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean as well. And
Purposefully.
purposefully. And with the technology of that time, they'd never ever thought that the wreck would be able to be investigated, because you just couldn't do it until more recently, So yeah, when I think I mentioned this before, but when Ballard examined the wreckage, he saw these mysterious, unaccounted for thick steel support struts bracing the keel, which were consistent with the alleged repairs to Olympic after the Hawke incident, but they didn't appear on the blueprints. So yeah, it would have been impossible that it could have happened without the collusion of the government. Yeah. So the other thing was, it was a common scam in those days to switch ships' identities. I spoke to a marine insurer, and he said, it still goes on today, but it was far more common in those days. He said it happened all the time. They used to switch the ship's identities to claim insurance. And Captain Lord of the Californian, he was blamed by both inquiries for the disaster. Strange, isn't it? That he wasn't really allegedly involved, and yet he was the guy who took the blame for it.
Yeah.
And he tried for the rest of his long life. I think he died in about 1962, about 50 years later. He tried to clear his name, but they wouldn't allow him to go to court, because they knew that any decent lawyer would have wiped the floor with the official story. So that's why, And I was an interesting crew member actually on Titanic. His name was Lewis Klein, and his name, very, very strangely, has been expunged from all the crew lists. I say very, very strangely, but if you're a conspiracy theorist like me, it's not strange at all. Okay, now Lewis Klein, an interesting character. We know he existed. We know he was on the ship because he actually made a statement. He was arrested on arrival at New York, placed under house arrest, and subpoenaed to appear at the inquiry a few days later. But he actually escaped, and he failed to show up at the inquiry. So we know he existed, and we know he was on the ship, and we know he was a crew member of the Titanic, but he couldn't speak English. Okay, very basic English he could speak, but he actually gave a written testimony in German to the German embassy, which was submitted to the inquiry, and it was translated. And I'm going to read that out because it's quite an interesting quote.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant.
Just stand on it. This was Klein's testimony. Okay, he said, "There was a ball following a banquet of some kind going on down below when I went up on watch at 9:30, and the captain and the officers were there with many passengers. After the party, the stewards sent the champagne and wines that were left over to the crew. I know that many of them were drunk. A passenger standing at the rail saw something dead ahead or maybe a little to the starboard. Look, quick, see the hill over there? I saw it was a big iceberg and ran for the bridge. The third officer was coming and yelled to me to ask what the matter was. I couldn't stop to answer, I was too excited. I ran for the spar with the crow's nest on it and shouted to the lookout I knew was up there to give the alarm. Not a word did I hear, so I started up the spar. It was less than a minute after I left the promenade deck that I got to the top of the spar and found the lookout fast asleep. I rang the alarm bell myself.
Wow. And there was also another rumor about the lookouts didn't even have binoculars, funnily enough, or something.
They didn't
like
have
that.
binoculars, no.
Yeah.
No. Again, I think that's a little bit of a red herring. Personally, I think it was a genuine oversight.
But again, I mean, how can you be on such an important job?
Absolutely.
And also in the crow's nest with the cold air hitting you as well.
Yes.
How are you able to fall asleep? Is that? I mean, I might be far-reaching a little bit here, but maybe something was slipped into someone's drink, perhaps.
Maybe, I don't know. That is pure speculation.
Oh, that is pure speculation. That is literally just me throwing a random thing out there. Like
no, absolutely, I understand. But yeah, I mean, it was the stillest night ever on the North Atlantic. It was absolutely still, and the Atlantic was like a pond. It was like glass. It was so smooth. So there wasn't anything in the way of wind, but you still get the the rush of wind as the ship moved forward. Yes, I take that point too. So Titanic actually cost £2.5 million to build it.
Is that into today's currency or
no,
back then? How much roughly would, if you had to estimate? I'm trying to.
It's $250 million.
Oh, bloody hell!
Yeah, bloody hell indeed. Yeah. Now the badly damaged Olympic was obviously uninsurable. Okay, so but White Star Line normally insured their ships for 75% of the value. So the payout for Titanic should have been about 1.8 million.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the insurance on Titanic, and stop me if you've heard this story before somewhere, was upped the week before the maiden voyage to 3.2 million.
Oh, wow.
And it was paid out within a week of the disaster.
Wow.
Shades of the Twin Towers, perhaps, and Larry Silverstein and his insurance job. But there you go. So, I mean,
again, just as so to me, that's so you've got the definitive proof that they swapped out the ships. You've got the definitive proof of the physical differences, I think, with the photos of the repairs that you said, and also the portholes, the number of them and the spacing of them is just so, it's just something that you can't deny. You can see it with your own eyes. You can't deny it. That's that. And then you've got the proof, is what I consider to be basically proof of this cover-up with the insurance money. I mean, I've never heard of any kind of business transaction going like that. Have you? It's just not. It's not logical, and it's so obviously blatantly preempted and pre-planned.
Yes, absolutely. But of course, it's all covered up. You see, this is why it's not out in the public domain, and this is why people like me have to bring this to people's attention, because that's my job. You know. So yeah, I spent a long time researching it. So.
How hard did you have to dig for all this information? How difficult was it? And once you started uncovering it, did you were you in a bit of denial at first, or did you already have a suspicion, which is what made you kind of go, oh, I'm going to look into this a bit more?
I already had a suspicion. Like I said, I was always interested in the Titanic story. So, you know, that was kind of the motivation for looking at it in a bit more detail. But by that point in time, we're talking like 2010 when I first started looking into it, I'd already been researching for 13 years anyway, and I knew that the world wasn't as we believe it to be. So, you know, it was just a normal, natural thing for me to do, to look at the Titanic situation. And, you know, as I went down the rabbit hole, more and more little, you know, branches from that rabbit hole went off here, there, and everywhere, and eventually I pieced it all together. It wasn't that difficult, actually. You know, I had to look in a lot of different places, and it did take me a long time, you know, best part of 3 years, but I got there in the end, and yeah. So it was very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story because, as I said earlier, it's just something that everyone just takes as historical fact. And there were always so many unanswered questions with the Titanic. I mean, I think, if anything, the original story now seems more far-fetched. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. the whole story, as I said right at the very beginning, is kind of it's a drama that has everything, doesn't it? And this is why they do it. They make it so dramatic. They suck people into this official narrative, and then people begin to believe that it couldn't possibly not be true because it's so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Everybody knows the Titanic story, but they don't. They think they know the Titanic story.
Yeah. I suppose that like the main thing is the isolation of knowing certain things and maybe having family that are somewhat asleep to it and thinking, no, oh, why can't you just see this for what it is? And it can be quite frustrating. Have you come up against any of that?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Is it the typical what you'd expect?
Yeah, I mean, my family, years and years before that, when I first started doing this kind of stuff, investigating all the lies that were told, my families thought I'd gone crazy. I mean, they thought, they wanted me to see a psychiatrist, and I'm sectioned.
Oh wow, really? That's
seriously,
rather extreme.
But eventually, it took a long number of years, but eventually they all came around to believe what I believe, and
Oh wow.
So, but it took a long time before that happened, and at the time when I first started researching all the stuff that I research, I didn't know anyone else at all. No one that was doing the same thing. I mean, David Icke was around, but I didn't know him. I wasn't in contact with him.
Yeah.
I had one or two other people like Edward Griffin, and names escape me now. Bill Cooper. But these were the only people I knew. I didn't know anybody to speak to or communicate with at all. It was just me, and I was all alone in this little world of truth.
That does sound really isolating.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was. I went through very, very traumatic times. Yeah, because it's a very lonely place. Is the truth?
It
Very
is.
lonely place. When you live in a world of lies, the truth is seen as a very radical thing.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic. Is there anything else that you would like to add that you think would give a bit more context to the story, or?
Not really. I mean, I think I'd like to mention that, this is what I do for a living. This is my livelihood. So if anybody would like to buy my books.
Yes, if you want to shout out a few titles, or if there's any sort of social media where anyone can find you, or a channel of some kind, if you want to give that a shout
I don't
out.
do social media.
Okay.
When you do what I do, it's virtually impossible to do social media because you just get absolutely inundated with abuse
And you get cancelled these days.
And get cancelled. I mean, my website is falsificationofhistory.co.uk. On that website, you can buy all of my books. I have 8 at the moment, and one is due to be published this month or next month, depending on how the next few weeks go. And my first book was called The Falsification of History, which is a very good grounding for anyone who wants to know the truth about what's really going on in the world. And that was followed by RMS Olympic, which is a true story of the Titanic that you've just been listening to now. And that was followed immediately by Titanic's Last Secret, which is a novel based on the factual book RMS Olympic. After that, I wrote something called Behind the Curtain, which is a absolutely massive tome. It's 600 and odd thousand words, and it's an expose of the plans for the New World Order and the banking industry and how they're involved and all that kind of stuff. Then I wrote JFK, A Very British Coup, which is a story about JFK assassination from a different point of view to, you've probably never heard before, where I provide evidence that it was the British Crown Empire that murdered JFK.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I wrote The Falsification of Science, which is like a companion book to The Falsification of History. And it talks about how science has been systematically falsified for millennia in order to keep us under control. And, there's lots of stuff in there about health, for example, medicine, nuclear weapons hoax, all kinds of things. But, just the way that science has been manipulated and altered and falsified, to keep us in our little box. And then the one after that was called Welcome to the Masquerade, and that was about what happened in the years 2020 to 22 and all the history of that and how that came about, and the just a dissection and analysis of the COVID thing.
I will definitely be throwing myself into those books.
So they can all be purchased from my website. So not www, just falsificationofhistory.co.uk. You can purchase signed copies direct from me on the website. If you're outside of the UK, I can't post abroad because they just get lost. It's just crazy. It's Amazon. You can go to my Amazon author page, which if you just go to Amazon wherever you are in the world and type in John Hamer, you'll find all my books. You'll find my author page with all my books on it. So yeah,
that's great.
obviously all your support would be very much appreciated.
Yes, absolutely.
And welcomed.
Please make sure to go and read his books, buy them, and support people who tell the truth that not many other people may be willing to tell. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a really fascinating subject. I hope that I get to talk to you again at some point in the future. We can dive down some other rabbit holes because there's definitely a lot to cover.
I'd love to, yeah.
Definitely a lot to cover. But thank you so much for coming on.
You're very welcome.
For more exclusive behind-the-scenes content, please be sure to subscribe to our Patreon. It really helps us cover the cost of any live streams, events, protests, or anything that we do. You'll also be seeing any behind-the-scenes footage and anything that we might be doing with Defiance Records.
Resistance GB's new series, 1,000 Words, has me, portrait artist Jake Fern, talking to some of the key figures in the movement. Half my brain concentrating on having a conversation, and the other half on making a painting. Do I succeed at either? You be the judge.